You know that feeling, right? One minute you're driving, or reading, or just staring into space, and the next you kind of snap back to reality and realize you've been totally zoned out. Well, today we're going to unpack that feeling. We're going to explore what dissociation really is, from those super common everyday moments to the much more complex experiences that can shape our lives. Let's get right into it.
Seriously, have you ever had that strange sensation where you feel like a spectator in your own life? Almost like you're watching a movie of yourself and you're just detached from what's happening? If you've ever felt that, you are definitely not alone. It's a surprisingly common human feeling.
And believe it or not, these moments that we all have are actually mild forms of dissociation. Think about it. Highway hypnosis. We are driving and suddenly realize you don't remember the last few miles? Or getting so lost in a good book that the world around you just melts away? That's it. It's a totally normal, everyday part of how our minds work. It's just a way of shifting our focus and attention.
Okay, but there's a lot more to it than just daydreaming. Dissociation actually exists on a spectrum. It ranges from these very common, everyday experiences all the way to some pretty significant clinical conditions. So let's explore that range a little bit.
So what's the official definition? Well, at its absolute core, dissociation is a disconnection. Imagine your mind's most important functions, your memory, your perception of the world, your sense of who you are. Imagine them all being tightly woven together. Dissociation is what happens when those links temporarily loosen or even break, which changes how you experience yourself and the world around you.
And this spectrum here shows how it progresses. So on one end, you have that simple absorption we talked about. Move a little further down the line, and you might experience something called depersonalization. That's the feeling of being detached from your own body, or derealization, where the world itself seems kind of unreal or foggy. And then further still, you find more profound experiences like amnesia and, at the very far end, significant alterations to one's sense of self.
And get this, these experiences are way more common than you'd probably think. One study found that a staggering 83% of people reported experiencing that first level, that deep absorption and imaginative involvement. So the big takeaway here is that at its core, this is a shared human experience.
Which, leads to a really interesting question. If pretty much everyone experiences some form of dissociation, why does that word bring up such intense, sometimes even scary images? What is behind this really dramatic reputation?
Well, the answer lies in this major scientific debate. For decades, experts have been split between two very different ways of explaining what's happening when we dissociate. Is it a biological event that's happening inside our brains, or is it more of a social performance that's shaped by our culture? Let's break down these two camps. So on one side, you have the psychiatric view. It sees dissociation as a universal brain state, a kind of built-in defense mechanism that kicks in to protect us from overwhelming trauma. But on the other side, the anthropological view sees it as a social performance, like a cultural script that we learn to express certain feelings or ideas that are shaped by our society.
This quote really gets to the heart of that first view. It basically frames dissociation as an evolutionary tool, something essential for survival. The whole idea is that when you can't physically escape a situation, your mind creates a psychological escape, protecting you from the full force of a terrifying experience.
But the anthropological view just turns this whole idea on its head. It argues that dissociation isn't some glitch caused by trauma, but it's actually a feature of human culture. It can be a tool for communication, a way to express forbidden emotions, a way to participate in spiritual rituals, or even to create a social space for alternate identities, like you see with spirit possession in some cultures.
So who's right? Is it our brains or is it our culture? Well, the latest thinking suggests it's not really an either-or question. Instead, it seems to be this fascinating interaction between the two, something that's been called the bio-looping effect. Right, so instead of seeing these as two competing ideas, we can see them as two halves of a whole. The brain state and the cultural role, they're not separate things at all. They're actually locked in a continuous feedback loop, where they are constantly influencing and reinforcing each other. So how does this loop actually work? Well, it all starts with a real, biological event happening in the brain. Picture your prefrontal cortex just dialing down your emotional response during intense stress, or that feeling of intense focus when you're completely in the zone. It's a raw, physical sensation, even if it's subtle. This is the biological reality of it, the hardware firing up. Okay, so you have this raw, physical sensation, but it needs a story, it needs a name, and that is where culture steps in.
Depending on your background and your beliefs, that internal brain state might be interpreted as a traumatic response, or it could be seen as a spiritual experience like spirit possession, or maybe even a positive state of creative flow. We use the narratives that are available to us to label what we're feeling.
And this is where the loop closes. And honestly, where things get really cool. The story we tell ourselves about the feeling, it actually changes our brain. That cultural script starts to carve deeper grooves in our neural pathways. So the next time a similar trigger comes along, the brain knows exactly which path to take. The whole experience becomes an easier, more practiced response. The brain and culture aren't just interacting. They are literally co-creating our reality.
So let's bring all of this back down to a personal level. What does this all mean for those really common feelings of numbness or apathy that so many of us experience, especially after we've been through periods of intense stress?
Well, it's really helpful to be precise here. So dissociation, remember, is that specific feeling of detachment. Emotional numbness is a little different. It's more like a protective shutdown, an inability to access emotions. And then apathy is a loss of motivation and interest. They can definitely overlap for sure, but they are distinct experiences. I really love this quote because it reframes emotional numbness not as some kind of personal failure, but as a function. It's your brain literally hitting a pause button when you're overwhelmed. It is not a flaw. It's a biological strategy to keep you from being completely flooded by stress or trauma.
And this brings us right back to our central theme, doesn't it? The meaning of these experiences is everything. The very same brain state can be interpreted as a devastating symptom of trauma in one context or a transformative spiritual experience in another. Your personal and your cultural narratives are what give the feeling its power and its meaning.
So I'll just leave you with this question to think about. When you experience these zoned-out states, do you see your inner world as some kind of fortress that needs to be defended? Or could you maybe see it as a landscape that's meant to be explored? Thinking about it that way, well, it might just change everything. Thanks for joining me.